The lights above the Dallas convention stage burned bright, but the tension in the room burned brighter. Business moguls, investors, and media elites had gathered for what was billed as the most exclusive innovation panel of the year. The room buzzed with curated conversations and veiled egos until the doors at the back opened and actor Jonathan Roumie stepped in. He didn't belong here. At least that's what the invitation list suggested. He wasn't a billionaire, he wasn't a tech founder, and he certainly wasn't part of the elite club that had gathered under the soft glow of chandeliers and corporate bravado. But Jonathan walked in anyway, head high, shoulders squared, and wearing a deep blue blazer that said he came with purpose, not permission. Businessman Kevin O'Leary, seated center stage, glanced up from his notes, his eyes locking onto Jonathan's with a flicker of irritation. He leaned toward the mic, voice calm but laced with condescension. "Did someone let the Hollywood types in here?" A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Cameras zoomed. Jonathan didn't blink. He took his seat at the panel table, reserved ironically for rising voices in leadership. The irony wasn't lost on him. The moderator, sensing the tension, tried to smooth things over. "Let's welcome actor Jonathan Roumie." And well, a rising voice, clearly. It was meant as a compliment. It sounded like a question. Kevin O'Leary leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms. "Let's just hope he knows what he's talking about." That was it. No one laughed this time. Jonathan smiled just slightly. He turned toward O'Leary, his tone steady, his words chosen like surgical strikes. "I may not be worth $1 billion, but I've stood in rooms that required more than money, rooms that demanded backbone." A murmur swept the room. Kevin's eyebrow twitched, but he wasn't finished. "And if we're talking about leadership," he continued, now facing the audience, "maybe we should ask, is it about fortune or about the future?" The audience, once cold, now watched with sharper interest. Something had shifted. O'Leary leaned forward, lips parting for a reply, but whatever he was going to say got lost in the applause rising from the crowd's right flank. Actor Jonathan Roumie wasn't just in the room. He had just taken it. The break between panels had barely begun when businessman Kevin O'Leary cornered him. "You know this isn't Hollywood, right?" he said, his voice low, calculated, like a man who'd had too much press and too little pushback. "This is a space for innovators, builders, not actors with rehearsed lines." Jonathan didn't flinch. He sipped his water, calmly placed the cup down, and met his gaze like he'd met worse from critics and skeptical producers alike. "Good'em," he said. "Then I won't need to build a narrative. Just tell the truth." O'Leary's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected that. He turned to walk away, but not before muttering something into his mic, assuming it was off. "He's just noise." But his mic was on. The room froze. A few guests gasped. Phones came out. Live stream feeds caught it. The words echoed louder than he had intended, and Jonathan knew it. He turned to face the audience again, stepping up to the edge of the stage like someone reclaiming territory. "Did you hear that?" he said calmly, his voice rising just enough. "I'm not a CEO, not a mogul, but today I represent every young person who's been told they're just noise, every artist who's been spoken over, every leader who didn't come from wealth, but came with something more powerful." O'Leary stood frozen. Jonathan paused, scanning the room slowly. "I was told I didn't belong, that I'm too earnest, too faith-driven to be taken seriously. But I'm here, and I'm not leaving." Applause, real, growing, relentless. A tech founder on the second row stood, then another. The moderator, flustered, tried to bring the moment back to order. Let's return to the subject of innovation and future leadership," she offered weakly. Jonathan nodded, stepping back toward the table. "Exactly what I'm here to discuss." O'Leary forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. The moment had slipped, and everyone knew it. He reached for his notepad, scribbling something. Maybe a deflection, maybe a strategy. But for the first time that day, businessman Kevin O'Leary wasn't driving the conversation. Jonathan Roumie was. By the time the panel resumed, something about the energy in the room had shifted noticeably, irreversibly. Jonathan wasn't just holding his own, he was setting the tone. His answers were crisp, his presence composed. And though O'Leary tried to redirect the conversation to topics where he held leverage, venture capital, startup equity, exit strategy, Jonathan found his footing on every curve. But it was during the audience Q&A that the real shift began. A woman stood up from the back, young, no older than 22, wearing a press badge from an independent media site. Her voice was quiet but steady. Jonathan, you spoke about not coming from wealth. I think a lot of people in this room assume you've always had industry connections. Can you talk about your beginnings? Businessman Kevin O'Leary leaned forward, intrigued. This, he thought, was the weak spot. Pull back the curtain and reveal the privilege underneath, or maybe nothing worth hearing. But Jonathan didn't dodge. He turned toward the young woman with a nod of appreciation and then began. I grew up in a working-class family in New York. My dad was a salesman. My mom worked hard to keep our family together. We didn't have Hollywood connections from him. We had faith, grit, in a small apartment with a lot of love. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. My first acting gigs weren't glamorous. I was doing student films and waiting tables at 2 a.m., trying to make ends meet. I got told no more times than I can count, but every time I did, I just worked harder. Murmurs in the crowd, eyes shifted from O'Leary to him. And when I finally stood on a major set for a role that deeply resonated with me, he continued, his voice rising with quiet authority, I wasn't thinking about fame. I was thinking about my mom watching from that tiny living room in New York, finally seeing someone like us up there. A man in a blazer and designer loafers, seated 2 rows in front of O'Leary, leaned over and whispered to his colleague, this is leadership, not legacy. Kevin caught it. His jaw tightened. Jonathan smiled faintly, not smug, but certain. So, no, I didn't come from an acting dynasty, but I did come from something stronger. Real life. Applause broke out. Not a standing ovation, but something deeper. Respect. The moderator cleared her throat, clearly rethinking which panelist had the momentum. Thank you, Jonathan. That was powerful. O'Leary interjected. Let's not confuse sentiment with strategy. Jonathan turned his gaze on him like a spotlight. Sometimes the future isn't built by strategy, he said. It's built by those who were never supposed to be part of it, but showed up anyway. And for the second time that day, businessman Kevin O'Leary had no reply. That evening, the energy in the post-panel networking lounge was electric. Laughter, clinking glasses, flashes from press photographers. Yet all eyes occasionally darted toward the same pair of figures across the room, actor Jonathan Roumie and businessman Kevin O'Leary. Their exchange on stage had already gone viral, but Jonathan wasn't done. Back in his hotel suite, modest compared to O'Leary's penthouse, he flipped open his laptop. The screen glowed with bookmarked articles, archived interviews, and transcripts. He had a plan, not to get even, but to illuminate. He knew O'Leary's Achilles heel wasn't arrogance, it was contradiction. He rewatched his 2016 interview on entrepreneurship, one that contradicted everything he said on stage hours earlier. An interview in which he praised non-traditional thinkers, outsiders who disrupt norms, and people who challenge the room even when they don't fit in. He clipped it. Then he found an op-ed O'Leary had written during a previous economic downturn. He'd slammed corporate figures for being too polished, too scripted. Real leadership doesn't come from polish, it comes from perspective, he'd written. He clipped that too. The next morning, the final keynote aired live on business news channels, and surprise, actor Jonathan Roumie had been added to the lineup overnight thanks to a rising flood of online interest. Businessman Kevin O'Leary looked less amused than usual when he saw him seated across from him on stage. The moderator, sensing the tension, smiled nervously. Jonathan, you've generated quite the discussion. Final thoughts before we close out this year's summit? Jonathan's response was measured but devastating. You know, he began, I've heard a lot about who belongs in rooms like this, about what qualifies someone to lead. He glanced at O'Leary, then held up a printed page. Kevin, this is your 2016 interview, where you said the best leaders are often those who don't fit the mold. Outsiders, non-traditional voices. You encourage them to keep going, to disrupt. The audience stirred. O'Leary shifted in his seat. And this, he continued, holding up another printout, is your op-ed from a few years back, where you criticize polished insiders and praise those who speak with perspective over polish. You said real leadership was raw. He folded both papers and placed them on the table. So which version of you should we listen to? The one that praised people like me, or the one who tried to dismiss me as just noise? Gasps rippled across the room. O'Leary opened his mouth, but the moderator raised a hand. Let him finish. Jonathan did. I'm not here to score points. I'm here because I believe the future of leadership is being redefined, and that future doesn't belong to the loudest wallet, but to the clearest voice. Applause erupted. This time, a standing ovation. Kevin O'Leary sat frozen, not humiliated, just outplayed. Jonathan Roumie had done his homework. He hadn't attacked him. He'd simply held up a mirror. And what the room saw changed everything. The clip of Jonathan calmly quoting businessman Kevin O'Leary to his face exploded online. It trended within an hour. Major outlets picked it up with headlines like, "Jonathan Roumie outsmarts Kevin O'Leary on live stage. From dismissed to dominant, Jonathan turns the tables." Kevin O'Leary wasn't used to losing control of a narrative, especially not to someone half his age, and certainly not on his own turf. So that night he did what most billionaires with bruised egos and media access do. He went on air. O'Leary appeared on a primetime interview, smirking as always, but with an edge this time. "Look," he said, "I respect the ambition, but we shouldn't confuse well-rehearsed zingers with real substance. It's easy to score points when you cherry-pick quotes out of context." He leaned in, a subtle dig ready. "He's talented, no doubt, but this isn't a film set. This is the real world. You need more than slogans to build something that lasts." Jonathan saw it live. He sat still in his suite, hands folded in his lap. No reaction, just quiet focus. He didn't need to rage tweet. He didn't need to post a clever clip. He waited, and then the email started. From young professionals, business owners, even former O'Leary collaborators. "You spoke for us. He's been untouchable too long. Thanks for saying what we couldn't." The next morning, Jonathan was invited to speak on a podcast that catered to millennial entrepreneurs. He didn't mention O'Leary by name. He didn't have to. "When people say you need more than slogans," he said, "ask them what they've actually built that helped the everyday American." He smiled, his tone unwavering. "I come from where people work double shifts and still can't afford rent, where kids pray for heat in the winter. So if clarity and courage are slogans, I'll wear them with pride." The clip racked up over 2 million views in 24 hours. Back at O'Leary's camp, his advisors were split. "You're just feeding his popularity," one said. Another warned, "He's turning your words into his weapon." And it was true. Kevin had tried to reassert dominance with condescension, but Jonathan turned it into momentum. He wasn't fighting fire with fire. He was lighting a torch others could rally around. By the end of the week, a poll from a major outlet asked who won the summit. Jonathan Roumie, 68%. Kevin O'Leary, 23%. The rest undecided. And in those undecided minds, Jonathan had just planted a seed. The email arrived at 7:41 a.m. Subject line, invite, CNBC, roundtable, future of leadership panel. Jonathan read it twice. He wasn't surprised. After all, his name had been buzzing across business circles for a week. But what caught his eye was the guest list. Businessman Kevin O'Leary again. Except this time he wasn't the moderator. He wasn't the anchor voice. He was another panelist. Equal footing. Jonathan smiled, not because he wanted revenge, but because he knew something had shifted. He no longer needed to fight for a seat at the table. Now people were asking if the table even mattered without him. The day of the round table, the set was sleek. Walls of LED, cityscape views, high-def everything. Jonathan wore a crisp white blazer with navy trim, his silver cross necklace resting neatly at the collarbone. Calm, composed. O'Leary walked in later than the others, sunglasses still on. When he saw Jonathan already mic'd up and chatting with the CNBC host, his grin faded just slightly. The camera rolled. The host opened with the predictable, "We're joined by a powerhouse group today. Let's talk about how leadership is evolving in a divided America." O'Leary took the bait early. "Look, leadership today requires real-world experience, not just rhetoric, not media sound bites or acting talking points." Jonathan didn't flinch. When his turn came, he leaned forward. Real-world experience matters, absolutely. But real leadership is being able to listen, not just lead when it's easy, but when you're being questioned, challenged, doubted. He glanced at O'Leary, not accusingly, but pointed, especially by those who assume they've seen more simply because they've lived longer. The host raised an eyebrow. "Is that directed at someone?" Jonathan smiled faintly. "If the suit fits." Laughter broke across the room. Even one of the other panelists, an investor in his 60s, nodded in approval. The discussion continued. At one point, O'Leary jumped in. "You know, I built my empire from nothing. No handouts, no legacy invites." Jonathan responded smoothly. "And you should be proud of that, Kevin. Just like I'm proud, I made it from New York to major roles without a trust fund. Different routes, same lesson. No one has a monopoly on hard work." This time there were cheers, not just polite agreement, but genuine admiration. Viewers watching from home could sense it. The actor Kevin, once mocked for not belonging, he now owned the room. His arguments weren't louder. They were sharper. His presence didn't demand respect. It commanded it. And most importantly, he didn't just answer O'Leary. He redefined the conversation. As the CNBC lights dimmed and the credits rolled, the panelists exchanged polite goodbyes. The set emptied out gradually. Staff resetting cameras, guests heading to green rooms. Jonathan remained seated a few extra seconds, finishing a quick follow-up note on his phone. O'Leary watched him from the side, then gestured toward the hallway. Got a minute? He stood, nodded. They walked side by side down a glass-paneled corridor. The noise from the set faded behind them. Ahead, a quiet backstage lounge, cool, dimly lit, far from the buzz of the media frenzy outside. Jonathan folded his arms calmly. Go ahead. O'Leary didn't waste time. You're good, I'll give you that, but be careful. This whole smart, faith-driven actor with bite thing, people love it until you slip, and you will. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. And what makes you think I haven't slipped before? He shrugged. Because no one's aired it yet. He didn't smile. That's the difference between you and me. You're afraid of exposure. I don't care. I've already been underestimated, mocked, dismissed, and I'm still standing. O'Leary chuckled dryly. Yeah, but don't confuse going viral with being right. Jonathan stepped closer, just enough to lower his voice without losing presence. And don't confuse money with wisdom. You've got a brand. I've got a backbone. He leaned against the counter, expression tightening. You're making enemies fast, he muttered. I'm not here to be liked, he replied, his tone like ice under pressure. I'm here to tell the truth, even if it rattles billionaires. The air between them thickened. Then unexpectedly, O'Leary looked away and exhaled. You remind me of me before the cameras, before the comfort, when I actually believed this stuff mattered. Jonathan didn't blink. Maybe that's why you hate me. He met his eyes, and for the first time the smug armor slipped. Maybe. They stood in silence, not as enemies, but as opposites, forced to recognize each other. And that's when Jonathan said it. Not for effect, not for applause, just the truth. Kevin, this isn't a game for me, and I'm not playing a part. I'm not rehearsing zingers backstage. I've lived every line I say. He turned toward the exit. But if you want to keep trying me, just know I don't blink. O'Leary didn't follow. He just watched him walk away. And in that moment, for the first time since their battle began, he realized something unnerving. He hadn't rattled him. He'd awakened him. Jonathan's stride down the CNBC hallway wasn't just a walk off a set. It was a statement, and the world noticed. Within hours, the behind-the-scenes moment, caught in a leaked clip from a stage assistant's phone, went viral. Not because he yelled, not because he was theatrical, but because he was real. His line, I've lived every line I say, spread like wildfire. He doesn't blink, began trending on X by midnight. Young creatives posted clips of him from the summit. Aspiring leaders unexpectedly shared quotes about not needing approval to lead. Even centrists began commenting, whether you agree with him or not, he's fearless. That's leadership. By morning, cultural podcasts, business panels, and youth platforms were buzzing with analysis. One comment from a business school professor stood out. We're witnessing the emergence of a new archetype. Call it the combat authentic. Jonathan Roumie isn't rising despite the heat. He's rising because he embraces it. Back at the studio for an interview, Jonathan walked in as usual. Not a changed man, but a revealed one. Cameras clicked as reporters whispered. A CNN journalist leaned toward him during the break. You know they're calling you the anti-O'Leary now. Jonathan smirked. If by that they mean I don't sell out, guilty. He didn't gloat. He didn't soften. He just showed up. The one trait the public now associated with him more than any role or slogan. Outside the digital world, something else was shifting too. A group of young college leaders from Virginia sent him an open letter titled, We Don't Blink Either. They'd launched a campus leadership initiative in his name, focused on intellectual courage, spiritual grounding, and economic independence. It had over 2,000 signups in 48 hours. Businessman Kevin O'Leary, for his part, remained silent. No tweets, no statements, just one photo from a business roundtable. His smile thinner than usual, eyes darker. In private circles, his team floated the idea of reaching out to or Jonathan for a reconciliation event, maybe a fireside talk on generational leadership. His response, a polite but firm, not interested, because a Jonathan wasn't building a brand on moments. He was building a movement on meaning. And while most public figures crave the camera, he had mastered something rarer. He made silence speak. 2 days after the CNBC panel aired, Jonathan's team sorted through the mountain of emails, DMs, letters, and forwarded news coverage that had flooded in from across the country. Most were praise, some were attacks, a few were just noise. But one envelope, handwritten, stamped from Indiana, stood out. It was from a 16-year-old girl named Lily Rollins. Jonathan opened it slowly at his desk after a production meeting, the late afternoon sun stretching across his apartment floor like a silent observer. Dear Mr. Roumie, you don't know me, but I watched you on CNBC. I saw you stand up to Kevin O'Leary. I saw the way you didn't flinch, and I cried. My mom always said girls like us shouldn't talk back. We should smile more. Keep our heads down. I believed her until you. You didn't blink. You didn't shrink. You didn't ask for permission to lead. You just did. So I'm starting something. It's small, just 5 of us right now. We meet after school in the library. We talk about leadership and how to stand up for our values without being afraid. We call it the No Blink Club. You changed something in me. You made me brave. Thank you. Love, Lily. Jonathan blinked slowly this time, not from fear, but from the sudden sting behind his eyes. It wasn't that the letter was unusually poetic. It wasn't even about the club. It was that he saw his younger self in Lily's shaky handwriting. The boy who once wondered if anyone would ever take him seriously. The boy who prayed at night that his voice wouldn't just echo, but matter. He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a leather-bound journal where he kept his most personal notes. Then he called his publicist. I want to go to Indiana, he said. His publicist paused. Indiana? For what? Yep, I'm not announcing it. No press, just me and the girl who doesn't blink. The next week, without cameras or fanfare, Jonathan showed up at a quiet high school in Marion, Indiana. The principal had cleared a room. 5 teenage girls sat in a circle, nervously checking the door. When Jonathan walked in, the room froze. Lily gasped. Jonathan smiled, pulled up a chair, and said the words they would remember for the rest of their lives. You don't need anyone's permission to be heard. You just need your own courage. They talked for over an hour. No filters, no scripts, just truth. And when Jonathan left, the No Blink Club had tripled in size. Jonathan stood backstage at the National Youth Summit in Nashville 1 week after his quiet visit to Indiana. He wasn't the keynote speaker. At least he wasn't supposed to be. But word of his unannounced visit to Lily Rollins' high school had spread, first among educators, then youth leaders, and finally to media outlets desperate to frame him not just as an actor, but as a generational voice. The summit organizers had moved things around, shifted panels, cleared the slot before closing remarks, and now under a ceiling of bright spotlights, the crowd waited, not just with curiosity, but with expectation. Jonathan looked down at the card he'd brought. It had just 2 words written on it, no blink. He stepped into the light, his voice calm, but this time something more. There was a quiet fire behind every word. I never wanted a movement, he began. I never chased cameras. I never asked to be the answer to anyone's doubts. But I know what it's like to be 16, sitting in a room full of noise, and wondering if your voice can survive it. He paused, scanning the thousands before him. A girl in Indiana reminded me that courage is contagious, and it doesn't come from winning arguments. It comes from choosing to speak before you know you'll be heard. Applause swelled, first polite, then surging. You don't have to be loud to lead. You don't have to be rich or old or perfect. You just have to be ready, and you have to mean what you say. Now the room leaned in. Even the most skeptical eyes softened. They say I don't belong. They say I'm too earnest, too faithful, too honest. And to them, I say, watch me. The audience erupted. Teens stood, teachers clapped, and somewhere backstage, the summit's head organizer turned to a staffer and whispered, we just watched history bend a little. The next morning, the entirety of Jonathan's speech aired on major television networks and was uploaded to YouTube. Within a few hours, clips of the speech surpassed 1 million views. Lily's No Blink Club reached over 10,000 members within a week. Schools across the country requested to open branches, and across all platforms, one phrase echoed like a drumbeat. He doesn't blink, so neither will we. Some moments aren't about making a statement. They're about becoming one. Actor Jonathan Roumie didn't ask for applause. He wanted courage, and in doing so, he gave courage back to the next generation. If his story inspired you, if you've ever questioned whether you belong in this room, remember this. You don't need permission to lead. All you have to do is stop blinking. Subscribe to my channel because the world needs less rehearsed, more real words.